June 28, 1914. Sarajevo. A sunny morning that felt like any other. Crowds lined the streets, waving flags, cheering as the motorcade passed through. But in exactly 7 minutes, a single wrong turn down a narrow side street would set in motion a chain of events so catastrophic, so utterly devastating, that by the time the smoke cleared for years later, 20 million people would be dead. For empires that had ruled for centuries would be wiped off the map, and the world as humanity knew it would be gone forever. This is the story of how one bullet fired by a 19-year-old boy triggered the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. But here's what they never tell you in history class. Nobody actually wanted this war. Not the kings who declared it. Not the generals who planned it. Not even the young man who pulled the trigger. So how did it happen? How did the most powerful nations on earth, led by rational, educated men, stumble into a nightmare that would consume an entire generation? And why, once it started, couldn't anyone find a way to stop it? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about World War I. This isn't just a story about battles and trenches. This is a story about how a system designed to prevent war actually guaranteed it. About how pride became more important than millions of lives. And about a secret that was hidden for over 100 years. A secret that proves this entire war could have been stopped halfway through, but wasn't. Because admitting the truth would have been too painful. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, to understand how this catastrophe happened, we need to go back. Not just to that morning in Sarajevo, but to the decades before, when Europe was at the height of its power and optimism. Picture the world in the year 1900. For the first time in human history, technology was advancing faster than anyone could have imagined. Electricity was lighting up cities. Telephones connected people across continents. Trains and steamships had made the world smaller than ever before. Medicine was conquering diseases that had plagued humanity for thousands of years. And the major powers of Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, controlled nearly the entire globe between them. They had colonies on every continent. Their economies were booming. Their militaries were the most advanced ever created. And at the top of it all sat the royal families, many of them related by blood, cousins and uncles and nephews, all descended from the same grandmother, Queen Victoria of England. These weren't distant strangers. These were family members who spent summers together, who sent birthday telegrams and exchanged photographs of their children. King George of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas of Russia didn't just rule empires. They were cousins. They called each other Georgie, Willie, and Nicky. They wore each other's military uniforms as honorary gestures. They genuinely cared about one another. And yet, in just 14 years, these three cousins would be at war, sending millions of men to kill each other in the mud. But in 1900, war between the great powers seemed impossible. Why? Because Europe had created something it believed would keep the peace forever. A system of alliances. The logic was simple and, on the surface, brilliant. If you attack my ally, I will attack you. This meant that any country thinking about starting a war would have to think twice, because they wouldn't just be fighting one enemy. They'd be fighting half of Europe. It was deterrence through fear. Mutually assured destruction before that phrase even existed. On paper, it was genius. In reality, it was a loaded gun pointed at everyone's head, with the trigger connected to 1,000 tripwires. The two main alliance blocks were clear. On one side, you had the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, bound together by formal treaties. On the other side, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain, who had agreed to support each other if attacked. But these alliances weren't just military agreements. They were automatic. They required mobilization the moment a member was threatened. And mobilization in 1914 wasn't like today. It wasn't pressing a button. It was calling up millions of reservists, commandeering trains, moving troops to borders, a process that once started could not be stopped or reversed without total chaos. And here's the thing nobody talks about. These alliances were supposed to make everyone feel safe. But instead, They made everyone paranoid. Every nation began to assume the worst about its neighbors. If France was building up its military, Germany saw it as preparation for invasion. If Germany expanded its navy, Britain saw it as a direct threat. If Russia mobilized to protect its interests, Austria saw it as aggression. Trust evaporated. An arms race began. And underneath all the grand palaces and diplomatic dinners, Europe was turning into a powder keg. But there was something else, something even more dangerous, that was tearing at the fabric of these empires from within. Nationalism. This is the part of the story that gets ignored, but it's absolutely critical to understanding why the war happened at all. See, in 1914, most of Europe wasn't made up of neat, unified countries like we have today. It was a patchwork of empires that ruled over dozens of different ethnic groups, many of whom hated being part of those empires. Austria-Hungary alone governed Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Croats, and Serbs. The Russian Empire controlled Poles, Finns, Ukrainians, Jews, Muslims, and dozens of other groups. The Ottoman Empire, though declining, still held Arabs, Armenians, Kurds, and Greeks under its rule. These weren't unified nations. They were pressure cookers, and millions of people inside these empires wanted out. They wanted independence. They wanted their own countries. They wanted freedom, and some of them were willing to kill for it. Nowhere was this more true than in the Balkans, that volatile region of southeastern Europe where Austria-Hungary's empire bordered the small, fiercely independent kingdom of Serbia. Serbia had only recently won its independence from the Ottoman Empire, and it had big dreams. It wanted to unite all the South Slavic peoples, the Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, into one great nation. The problem was, millions of these people lived inside Austria-Hungary, in a region called Bosnia, which Austria had annexed just a few years earlier in 1908. The Serbs in Bosnia didn't want to be part of Austria-Hungary. They wanted to be part of Serbia, and Austria knew this. They knew that Serbian nationalists were a threat to their empire. If Bosnia broke away, other regions might follow. The empire could collapse from within. So Austria watched Serbia closely, looking for any excuse to crush the threat once and for all. And that brings us back to June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, decided to visit Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, on a state visit. It was a gesture meant to show strength, to remind the Bosnians who was in charge. But the date he chose was deeply insulting. June 28th was a Serbian national holiday, a day commemorating a historic battle where Serbia had fought for its freedom. For Serbian nationalists, having the future Austrian emperor parade through their streets on that day was the ultimate insult. And a small group of young radicals decided they weren't going to let it happen. Their names don't matter now. They were teenagers, most of them not even 20 years old, sick with tuberculosis, desperate, idealistic, and convinced that killing the Archduke would somehow strike a blow for freedom. They were given bombs and pistols by a shadowy Serbian nationalist organization called the Black Hand, a group with links to Serbian military intelligence. The plan was simple: line up along the Archduke's route, and when his car passed, throw the bombs. Kill him. Send a message. That morning, as the Archduke's motorcade rolled through Sarajevo, the first assassin lost his nerve and did nothing. The second pulled out a bomb, struck it against a lamppost to activate it, and hurled it at the car. But the driver saw it coming and sped up. The bomb bounced off the back of the car, rolled under the vehicle behind them, and exploded, wounding several officers and bystanders. Chaos erupted. The Archduke's car sped away. The bomber, realizing what he'd done, swallowed a cyanide pill and jumped into a nearby river to drown himself. The cyanide was old. It didn't work. The river was 4 inches deep. He survived, vomiting and humiliated, and was arrested immediately. The other conspirators scattered. One of them, a 19-year-old boy named George, thought it was over. The mission had failed. The Archduke had escaped. George walked away from the scene, confused, shaken, wondering what to do next. He wandered into a nearby cafe and sat down, probably trying to process what had just happened, trying to figure out if he should flee the city or just go home. Meanwhile, The Archduke and his wife Sophie, who had insisted on coming with him despite the danger, were shaken but alive. After a brief meeting at City Hall, where the Archduke angrily demanded better security, he made a decision. He wanted to visit the officers who had been wounded in the bombing. It was the noble thing to do. His security team agreed, but there was confusion about the route. The original plan had been abandoned. The new route wasn't clearly communicated to the drivers. And as the motorcade set off again, the lead driver, not knowing the plan had changed, turned right down a narrow side street, following the original route. The Archduke's driver followed. Within seconds, an official in the car shouted that they were going the wrong way. The driver stopped, started to reverse, and at that exact moment, purely by chance, the car stopped directly in front of the cafe where George was sitting. 5 feet away, George looked up, saw the Archduke, saw his wife. For a split second, time froze. Then George stood up, walked toward the car, pulled out his pistol, and fired twice. The first bullet hit Sophie in the stomach. The second hit the Archduke in the neck, severing his jugular vein. Sophie collapsed immediately. The Archduke, blood pouring from his neck, turned to his wife and whispered, "Stay alive for the children." Within minutes, they were both dead. George tried to turn the gun on himself, but was tackled by the crowd before he could. He was beaten, arrested, and dragged away. And in that moment, in those 7 seconds, the world changed. Because what happened next wasn't inevitable. It was a choice. A series of choices, made by men who thought they were protecting their nations, but who were actually condemning them. When news of the assassination reached Vienna, the capital of Austria-Hungary, the emperor, an 84-year-old man who had ruled for 66 years, was devastated. But his military advisors saw an opportunity. Finally, they had an excuse to deal with Serbia once and for all. They drafted an ultimatum, a list of 10 demands so extreme that no sovereign nation could accept them without surrendering its independence. Serbia would have to suppress all anti-Austrian organizations, remove any officials Austria found objectionable, and allow Austrian police to operate inside Serbian territory to investigate the assassination. It was designed to be rejected, and Austria knew it. Serbia, desperate to avoid war, agreed to 9 of the 10 demands. They asked only that the demand allowing foreign police on their soil be negotiated, as it violated their sovereignty. A reasonable request. Any diplomat could have worked with that. But Austria didn't want negotiation. They wanted war. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. And that's when the alliance system activated like a doomsday machine. Russia, which saw itself as the protector of all Slavic peoples, announced it would defend Serbia. The Tsar didn't want war. He and the Kaiser exchanged desperate telegrams, calling each other Nicky and Willie, begging each other to find a way out. But their military generals told them the same thing. If you don't mobilize now, we'll be destroyed. Mobilization meant survival. Hesitation meant death. So Russia mobilized. Germany, bound by treaty to Austria and terrified of being caught between Russia and France, demanded Russia stop its mobilization. Russia refused. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. But Germany had a problem. They knew that if they fought Russia, France would join in, because France and Russia were allies. So Germany's military plan, crafted years earlier by a general named Alfred, was to strike France first, knock them out of the war quickly, then turn all their forces east to fight Russia. The plan required speed, and it required invading France through Belgium, a small neutral country that had done nothing to anyone. Belgium refused to let German troops pass. Germany invaded anyway, and that decision brought Britain into the war. Britain had no treaty obligation to defend France or Russia, but they did have a treaty from 1839 guaranteeing Belgium's neutrality. When Germany violated that treaty, Britain declared war on Germany. And just like that, in 5 weeks, Europe went from one assassination to total war. Millions of men were called up. Trains packed with soldiers rolled toward the borders. Crowds cheered in the streets, waving flags, singing songs, convinced the war would be over by Christmas. The generals promised quick, glorious victories. The newspapers printed propaganda about defending civilization. And nobody, Not one person in power understood what was about to happen. Because this wasn't going to be like the wars of the past. This was going to be industrial slaughter on a scale humanity had never seen. The soldiers who marched off to war in August 1914 believed they were going to fight the way their grandfathers had, with cavalry charges, bayonets, and honor. What they found instead was barbed wire, machine guns, and poison gas. Within months, both sides had dug hundreds of miles of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. And for the next 4 years, those lines barely moved. Imagine being a soldier in one of those trenches. You're standing in a ditch, sometimes waist deep in freezing mud and water. Rats the size of cats crawl over the bodies of your dead friends because there's nowhere to bury them. The smell is unbearable, a mix of rotting flesh, human waste, and chemicals. You haven't slept in days because the shelling never stops. And then the order comes. Fix bayonets. Climb out of the trench. Run across 200 yards of open ground while machine guns fire 600 rounds per minute at you. Artillery shells explode all around, throwing up geysers of mud and body parts. Barbed wire tangles your legs. And if you're lucky enough to make it across, you get to jump into the enemy trench and fight hand to hand with knives and clubs. And if you survive that, you hold the trench until the enemy counterattacks and pushes you back. All of that for maybe 10 yards of ground. And then you do it again tomorrow. That was World War I. Millions of men were ordered to walk into machine gun fire. And they did it because refusing meant execution for cowardice. The generals kept promising that one more push, one more offensive, would break through. But it never did. In 1916, at the Battle of the Somme, the British lost 20,000 men on the first day. 20,000. In one day? By the time the battle ended months later, over 1 million men were dead or wounded. The ground gained? 6 miles. At Verdun, the French and Germans fed men into a meat grinder for 10 months, losing 700,000 soldiers between them, just to end up where they started. And the worst part? Everyone knew it was pointless. Soldiers wrote letters home describing the horror, begging their families to understand that this wasn't war, it was murder. One soldier wrote, "If the people back home could see what we see, they would demand this end tomorrow, no matter who wins." But the letters were censored. The newspapers lied. The governments told their citizens they were winning, that victory was just around the corner, that the sacrifices were noble and necessary. And so the war continued. But it wasn't just bullets and shells that killed. In 1915, Germany introduced a new weapon, chlorine gas. Released from canisters when the wind was right, it rolled across no man's land in a yellow-green cloud. When soldiers breathed it in, their lungs filled with fluid. They drowned on dry land, choking, clawing at their throats, dying in agony. The Allies responded with their own gas. Then Germany escalated with mustard gas, which didn't just poison you. It burned. It blistered your skin. It blinded you. It soaked into your uniform and kept burning for days. Soldiers who survived gas attacks were never the same. Some went blind. Some had lungs so damaged they couldn't walk upstairs for the rest of their lives. And then there was shell shock. That's what they called it then. Today we call it PTSD. Soldiers who had seen too much, endured too much, simply broke. They would shake uncontrollably, unable to speak, unable to function. Some wandered away from the trenches in a daze and were shot as deserters. Others were court-martialed and executed for cowardice. Because in 1914, mental trauma wasn't understood. If you couldn't fight, you were a coward. Thousands of boys, some as young as 16, lied about their age to enlist, thinking war was adventure. They came home old men, if they came home at all. Entire towns in Britain and France sent every boy of fighting age to war. Some towns lost all of them. Every single one. There are memorials in villages across Europe listing 30, 40, 50 names from the same small community, all dead. Families were wiped out. Bloodlines ended. An entire generation was lost. And still, the leaders on both sides refused to consider peace. Why? Because by 1916, they were trapped. Trapped by pride. Trapped by propaganda. Trapped by the weight of all the dead. How could they admit the war was pointless when 2 million men had already died? How could they tell mothers and fathers that their sons had died for nothing? So they kept the lie going. They told themselves and their people that victory was the only option, that quitting would dishonor the sacrifice. The politicians feared being blamed for losing. The generals feared being called failures. And so they sent more men to die, not to win, but to avoid the shame of admitting they were wrong. And here's the secret they kept hidden for 100 years. In December 1916, Germany sent a peace offer to the Allies. They proposed negotiations, a settlement, an end to the fighting. At that point, both sides were exhausted. Millions were dead. Economies were collapsing. Soldiers were on the brink of mutiny. It was the perfect moment to stop. But the Allied leaders rejected it. Why? Because accepting peace would have meant admitting the war had no clear winner. It would have meant all those deaths were for nothing. And politically, that was unacceptable. So they kept fighting. For 2 more years. Millions more died. And when the war finally ended in 1918, it wasn't because one side won a glorious victory. It was because everyone was simply too broken to continue. By 1917, the war had become a test of endurance. Who could outlast the other? And then 2 things happened that changed everything. First, Russia collapsed. The Tsar's government, overwhelmed by military failures, food shortages, and widespread anger, was overthrown in a revolution. The new government tried to keep fighting, but the Russian people had had enough. In November 1917, a radical group called the Bolsheviks, led by a man named Vladimir, seized power and immediately pulled Russia out of the war. For Germany, this was a miracle. Suddenly, they didn't have to fight on 2 fronts anymore. They could move every soldier from the east to the west and throw everything at France and Britain before the second big change could tip the balance. Because in April 1917, the United States had entered the war. America had tried to stay neutral. President Wilson wanted nothing to do with Europe's war. But Germany made a catastrophic mistake. They began unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any ship heading to Britain, including American vessels. Then British intelligence intercepted a telegram from Germany to Mexico, offering to help Mexico reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if Mexico joined the war against the United States. When that telegram was made public, American opinion exploded. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. But there was a problem. America didn't have a large army. It would take months, maybe a year, to train and transport millions of troops across the Atlantic. Germany knew this, and they knew they had one chance. When the war in the spring of 1918, before the Americans arrived in force, or lose everything. So in March 1918, Germany launched the largest offensive of the entire war. They threw everything they had at the British and French lines. And for a while, it worked. They broke through. They advanced further than anyone had in 4 years. Paris, the French capital, was within range of German artillery. Victory seemed possible. But Germany had one fatal problem. They had no reserves. Every man who could fight was already fighting. They had no food. The British naval blockade had been starving Germany for years. Soldiers were malnourished. Civilians were dying of hunger. And the German army, even as it advanced, was falling apart. Soldiers stopped to loot food from captured trenches because they hadn't eaten in days. Officers lost control. Discipline collapsed. Meanwhile, American troops were arriving in Europe at a rate of 10,000 per day. Fresh, well-fed, eager to fight. By summer 1918, the balance had shifted. The Allies launched a counteroffensive. Germany's lines buckled. Soldiers began surrendering in massive numbers. And back in Germany, the people had finally had enough. Riots broke out. The Navy mutinied. Workers went on strike. The government was collapsing. On November 9, 1918, the Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany, fled the country in the middle of the night and went into exile in the Netherlands. 2 days later, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. The war was over. Soldiers on both sides climbed out of their trenches, stunned. Some cheered. Some cried. Many just stood there in silence, unable to process that they had survived. In some places, enemy soldiers met in no man's land, shook hands, shared cigarettes. In other places, men who had been trying to kill each other for 4 years simply walked away without a word. The silence, after years of constant shelling, was deafening. But the war's end didn't bring peace. It brought something far worse. A treaty designed not to heal, but to punish. In June 1919, representatives from the Allied powers gathered at the Palace of Versailles in France to decide Germany's fate. And what they created was a document that would directly cause the next World War. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war. Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, stated that Germany and its allies were solely responsible for all the loss and damage of the war. This wasn't just humiliating. It was factually wrong. The war had been caused by a tangled web of alliances, nationalism, and miscalculation. But the Allies needed someone to blame. So they blamed Germany. And then they made Germany pay. The reparations were astronomical. Germany was ordered to pay the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars in today's money. Their military was reduced to almost nothing. They lost all their overseas colonies. Huge chunks of German territory were given to France, Poland, and other neighboring countries. Millions of ethnic Germans suddenly found themselves living in foreign nations. The German representatives who were forced to sign the treaty wept. They knew what this meant. One French general, a man named Ferdinand, looked at the treaty and said something chilling. This is not peace. This is an armistice for 20 years. He was right. Almost to the day. World War II began 20 years and 65 days after the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Because the treaty didn't create peace. It created resentment, humiliation, rage. It destroyed Germany's economy, leading to hyperinflation so severe that people needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. It shattered national pride. And into that void stepped a failed Austrian artist with a gift for speeches and a hatred for the treaty. His name was Adolf, and he promised to restore Germany's honor. We all know what happened next. But the cost of World War I goes far beyond the 20 million dead. For empires were destroyed. Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the German Empire all ceased to exist. In their place came instability, revolution, and the seeds of future conflicts. The Ottoman Empire's collapse led directly to the chaos in the Middle East that continues today. The Russian Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power, leading to 70 years of Soviet communism and the Cold War. The redrawing of Europe's borders created ethnic tensions that exploded in the Balkans again in the 1990s. And the generation that survived the war was scarred forever. They called them the Lost Generation. Writers, artists, soldiers who came home and found they couldn't relate to normal life anymore. Some became poets and novelists, trying to make sense of what they'd seen. Others drank themselves to death. Many committed suicide. The psychological wounds never healed. Families were torn apart. Entire communities were hollowed out. In France alone, 1.4 million men died. In some regions, there were villages where every man of fighting age was killed. Widows and orphans were everywhere. The demographic impact lasted generations. And here's the truly haunting part. In the middle of the war, there were moments when it could have stopped. In 1916, both sides were exhausted. Secret peace feelers were sent out. Diplomats quietly explored whether a negotiated settlement was possible. And it was. But the leaders on both sides suppressed those talks. They were afraid of looking weak. Afraid of admitting that all the deaths had been for nothing. So they kept the lie going. They kept the propaganda machine running. They kept sending boys to die. Not for victory. Not for freedom. But for pride. And that's the real lesson of World War I. It's not a story about evil. It's a story about systems, pride, and the inability to admit mistakes. The men who started the war weren't monsters. They were educated, rational leaders who thought they were protecting their nations. But they built a system that made war automatic. And once it started, their pride wouldn't let them stop it. Even when they knew it was pointless. Even when they knew millions were dying for nothing. They couldn't bring themselves to say the words, "We were wrong. Let's stop." And so the war ground on, year after year, until the entire continent was a graveyard. Today, over a century later, we have nuclear weapons. We have alliances that promise automatic retaliation. We have systems designed to deter war through the threat of mutual destruction. Sound familiar? It should, because we're using the same logic that led to World War I. We tell ourselves that these systems keep us safe. That deterrence works. That rational leaders will always find a way to avoid catastrophe. But World War I proves that's not true. Rational leaders, good people, can create systems that guarantee disaster. And once those systems activate, pride and fear can make it impossible to stop. So here's the question we need to ask ourselves. Have we learned anything? Or are we making the same mistakes, just with bigger weapons? I'll let you decide.